Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you at this webinar titled Advances in the Field of Socio-Economic Impact Assessment of Research Infrastructures and How Can These Help in Practice? My name is Elina Griniance from EFIS Centre. I'm the project manager of RIPATH project. And this is the first online event in a series of 3 webinars under the theme of a European framework of socio-economic impact of research infrastructures and what shall be the way forward. This series of webinars represent the closing of event of the RIPATH project, which is a Horizon 2020 funded project which is tackling exactly this theme. So today the aim is to take stock of the advances made in this area by the RIPATH project as well as other initiatives. But we intend to discuss more concretely how do these conceptual advancements, the knowledge we have generated in this field over the last couple of years, really help in practice. So what is the added value for practitioners, for RI managers, for operational staff that need to understand the impact that the facility is having beyond science, so on the economy and society, and also who need to implement more formal impact assessment exercises. The agenda for today, I will introduce first our 4 panel speakers who have kindly agreed to join us this morning and share their experiences and insights on the topic. Then I want to make a presentation of the key contributions of the RIPATH project. And I will also show you a glimpse into the online toolkit, which will soon be available for your exploration and use. Further, we will move to the panel discussion, where we will try to tease out what are really the challenges in performing impact assessments and what guidance is currently there and what might need to be developed in the future still. We also want to make this webinar an interactive webinar, so we'd love to hear the questions and reflections from the people in the audience. Hence, we will have a dedicated question and answer session at the last part of the webinar, which will be moderated by my colleague Henning Kroll from Fraunhofer ISI. And then we will wrap up and close this first webinar in roughly 2 hours. Now I'd like to introduce our 4 panel speakers. We have on the panel this morning Uta Gunzenheimer, who is the head of the External Relations and EU Project Group at the European Spallation Source. We have also Jana Koller, the Executive Director of CERN. We also have this morning Jennifer Edmund, the President of the Board of Directors of DARIA. And also we have Florian Blitzen, who is the Associate Director of Integrated Organizational Development at the Extreme Light Infrastructure Delivery Consortium. Our 4 panel members represent research infrastructures in various stages of the life cycle, so construction and operation. They represent various types of RIs, so single-sited, distributed, physical, and virtual, across various geographies and domains of science. And all our panel members have been involved in thinking about impact in their research infrastructures and how it can be measured and assessed and presented to the communities, funders, and policymakers. And I think due to the experience collected throughout years, I think they're very well placed to reflect on how far we have come in advancing our understanding in this field and what are maybe still gaps we need to address in the future. So now I would like to invite each of the panel members to take some 2 minutes and explain your personal journey, how you got involved in the socio-economic impact assessment of research infrastructures, and what have been the key questions that have really puzzled you? Because we know that this is a fast-growing field that generates a lot of interest, but it also poses a lot of questions. So I would like to hear about your journey and your questions. So first I invite Uta to share your insights.
So my journey, that can be clearly timed, started at ECRI 2016 in South Africa. I was so impressed from the then research minister there, Naledi Pandor, when she gave her presentations and was in these workshops about socio-economic impact assessment. And that was the time when I decided this is something we have to do at ESS. And then I teamed up with Vincent Martin, who was leading the OECD working group on impact assessment. And we created a project that we implemented thanks to the funding we got from the European Commission in the Brightness project to develop a methodology how ESS, which is an organization in construction, can approach its impact assessment. The ESS is under construction. It's a 2 billion euros investment that is shared among 13 member countries. We have still a long journey ahead of us. We will only go, into a users program after 2023. So we have a construction phase that's 10 years long. And the construction is not only done by cash contributions from the member states, and this is one of our key challenges now in the impact assessment. It is done through in-kind contributions. That means large parts of the facilities, especially the technical equipment, is being built by 40 partners, research labs in our partner countries. They build the core components and then they're being shipped to Lund, installed and commissioned there. And the challenge really is, how do we assess the impact that's associated with the construction of the in-kind contributions? That's my journey so far. We are now in a second iteration of our impact assessment at ESS. Again, thanks to the EU funding, we're able to do that in collaboration with the Technical University of Denmark, with Professor Jason D. Ying, where we now have fine-tuned our approach. We, enlarged the set of indicators. We have lots of measures that we are collecting, and we hope to have our first report available by the end of the summer.
Okay, thank you, Uta. Jana, your journey into the topic.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Now, at CERIC, we consider impact that we produce a key element of our sustainability. So when we have received the InfraDev project co-funded by European Commission, in that project we also dedicated some time to the development and assessment, development of methodology for impact assessment and development of societal return reports. Now, Rathenau was the institution that developed the theoretical approach to how we should address the impact assessment. And there, in their deliverable, there's one sentence that I consider extremely important for this discussion because it frames our problems very well. So impact of what and impact on what do we want to demonstrate? Of what, when it comes to research infrastructures, it's basically most of the impacts will be intended and linked to our objectives. This brings us to first two problems that we face. First of all, research infrastructures, as we have seen already with the development of monitoring indicators by S3, very much differ in their objectives. In fact, the only objective that they share is the enabling of science. So whatever system we put up in order to assess the impact needs to consider the wide variety of different objectives of the RIs. And the second problem is that these objectives are changing with time. In 5 years since we were established, there was the objective of open access to data that was added, and the latest one with the white paper is the objective that we need to address SDGs. The second question is on what do we want to demonstrate the impact? And that's, for example, on society and the economy, both of which the impacts will demonstrate in a decade or 2 decades. So how can we convincingly demonstrate this impact to the policymakers that fund us today, not the ones in 20 years? Because, you know, it's highly probable that they'll stop funding us unless that we demonstrate the added value. So this brings us to the second problem, which is basically the impacts are in 20 years or a few decades, and they're not only attributable, the attributions not only to us, but for example, if there's a scientific breakthrough, it's taken up by the company, then by society. So there's a number of different actors which should feed into this. So at the end, what we need is the approach to impact assessment that brings in a large number of different inputs, narratives, case studies, KPIs, in order to produce, let's say, a compelling evidence that we are likely to produce impact.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Jana. Jennifer, your journey?
Yes, hi. So I became a director of the Daria ERIC, I think in 2016, and became president of the board of directors in 2018. And I think during the first phase of the ERIC's development, and I think this is probably very natural, we were very focused on building the infrastructure we needed. But that meant that a lot of what I was seeing as a new director and a new director, the president of the board coming in, was a very sort of internalized language. And so it became a part of what I felt as my leadership role to help us to turn that all outside and look towards not what we were doing. You know, having a policy document wasn't good enough as a message for us. It's what that policy document enabled us to do for our community and beyond. So really, I guess you could say that my intense engagement with this started in 2018. And that was an interesting time because at the same time we saw the European Commission looking very strongly at how to define the impact of research infrastructures. And immediately, in particular, as Daria is a research infrastructure for the arts and humanities, we found that there were a number of challenges in the way impact was perceived that we were going to have to invent new ways that fit our infrastructure. These are things like the language of impact we felt was not suited to us in many ways. And I thought it was very interesting in many meetings where the vast majority of the research infrastructures would welcome economic impact. And in fact, that is one of the key areas the Commission points out as where a research infrastructure should have impact. But from our point of view, social impact is actually the easier thing for us to do than economic impact. Whereas I saw a direct equivalent between those two, others may not. And there was a real resistance to talking about socioeconomic impact at that point in time because and I would see it as some infrastructures were further ahead in that way than others. And when we defined our impacts, we released a strategic plan in the past couple of years. And one of the things we do is we do exactly as one of the previous speakers said, we talk about impact for whom, impact defined how. And so, for example, one of our impacts is organizational change. We have a large number of museums, libraries, archives, and other cultural heritage institutions involved in our network. If they are able to move towards a more fluid use of the digital and in their interactions with research, that's really important to us. So I think finding ways of making the language work for any given research infrastructure is important. Also, the methods were something that we felt we had to actually say, no, we can't do it that way. We have to do it this way. So we're in the process of developing our first set of qualitative case studies. And actually, we've learned a lot about both our impact and how we can express that in the process of moving towards these cases. And the last thing I'd say would be, actually, the frame of reference makes it very hard to talk about impact, I think, with research infrastructures. If infrastructure works, it disappears. And in particular, I think when you're talking about infrastructures that may be distributed, that may be virtual, that may be dealing with soft rather than hard infrastructure, and in particular when you're talking about research. So you're talking about people who are using our infrastructure to create knowledge, which is very intimate and very personal. I think at the next level out, even talking about the impact sometimes of socioeconomic or arts humanities research is difficult. When you back that up to how the research infrastructure actually it was a part of that. Sometimes it can feel like we're kind of fighting the identity wars around, well, who owns this particular impact? And of course, it shouldn't be that way. But this is another part where I think we need to redevelop the sort of the social contract around research and how we understand the difference it makes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Florian, your learnings on the journey?
Yeah, thanks, Elena, and good morning, everyone. Well, actually, my journey is a bit longer than what I've heard so far. I think I started talking about and learning about socioeconomic impact of research infrastructures back in 2009. I joined ELI in 2008, which was 2 years after it was first listed on the ESFIR roadmap. And Well, it came as a problem for us, actually, or a challenge for us from the very beginning, because ELI is a multi-site infrastructure. It's got 3 facilities in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Romania. And what ELI pioneered is actually the use of structural funds to finance construction. And as many might already know, the use of structural funds or the access to structural funds is conditioned, among others, to the demonstration of socio-economic impact. And there's a clear format for that, which is the cost-benefit analysis. So back in 2009, 2010, the 3 ELI facilities had to go through that exercise of running a cost-benefit analysis to justify that there was indeed a justification in terms of socio-economic impact to build those facilities in those 3 countries. Now, the thing is, at the time, I think people were starting to really show a growing interest in socio-economic impact of research infrastructures, which was going together, I think, with the development of research infrastructures really as a concept. And this was all led by S3. I remember a number of workshops at the time that were organized, which were more aimed, I think, at demonstrating in general the relevance of research infrastructures. There was no clear, there were a number of methodological approaches in the air that people were looking at. I think you reflect very well on that in your deliverable on the literature review. And this has evolved very well, I think, over the past 10 years in further defining what methodological approach is more suited to a particular audience or a particular context. And reflecting now on our experience 10 years ago, what I realized is that this was an exercise that was very artificial. We were talking to funders at the time within a framework that was more suited to traditional investments, roads, hospitals, and so on. There was no framework that was really suited for research infrastructures. The Czech Republic in particular, where there is one of the ELI facilities, had developed or adapted the CVA methodology for research infrastructures, but a number of initiatives have taken place since then. The last one, I think, was the ABUS project a few years ago, which revisited the CVA method and I think developed it very well for research infrastructures. Now, this was 10 years ago when we were asking for funding. And obviously, life has changed quite a bit at ELI. At the time, we were very few, and I'm in a building today which didn't exist, with more than 200 people around. And there are 2 other ELI facilities also off the ground. And we're looking at socio-economic impact in a very different way, obviously. We're not trying to convince an investor. We're still trying to convince investors, but in a different way. And we have also now a perspective which is very much that of a research infrastructure manager. And we are less focused, I think, on how much impact we're producing. This is something we have to demonstrate. This is something we have to communicate to society and our funders. But I think my concern and the concern of the other members of the management, I think, is really to think of, as Jana put it, I think, what is the type of impact on what and how has become really the question. I think we're we're interested in how to maximize impact, not so much in trying to get a value that we got, for instance, in the past with an input-output analysis. How many euros do we generate when a funder gives us €1? No, we are really interested in the mechanism of impact. And out of all the methods that have been, I think, reviewed in your deliverable that I mentioned earlier, we've tried many of them, except the ones that were really with pathways. So you end up demonstrating to a funder that you're relevant, but you actually don't demonstrate that you're capable of delivering impact, which is very different. And I think I won't repeat what my colleagues have said, but that is really, from the perspective of a research infrastructure manager, what matters most to me. It's really that question of, can I really be sure that I'm doing my very best to deliver impact? So I'll stop here. I'll say a few more words under the other questions, but that's it for my journey.
Thank you very much for your journey, some of which really span 10 years. I think it's very relevant for context, because acknowledging that the concept of research infrastructure solidifying, and also there is no single framing about impact and socioeconomic impact of research infrastructures. Commission set out the call for a Horizon 2020 project, RI Path. So I will go over the key contributions from this project, which was focused exactly on this topic, but the key contributions on a conceptual level. So how can we understand and how can we talk about socioeconomic impact? For those in the audience who are less familiar with the project and haven't really got the chance to get more detailed reading on it. So RIPATH project is a coordination and support action funded by Horizon 2020, and it was announced in January 2018, and it will close in a week on 30th of June. So we had roughly 30 months of work tackling the topic of socioeconomic impact of research infrastructures. So beyond just the scientific impact, what are the contributions to economy and the society? We have 8 project partners, so 4 partners who are more evaluation, research and innovation policy expertise bringing in. And we also have, so this is European Future Innovation Systems Centre, Centre for Industrial Studies, the European Science Foundation and Fraunhofer ISI. We also had in the consortia 4 research infrastructures who helped to co-design and pilot a lot of the learning we've done conceptually in more practical terms. So those are ELIXIR, CERN, ALBA and DESY. This is the project consortia, and the mission of the project was exactly that, to give policymakers, funders and research infrastructure managers the tools to assess their impact on the economy and contribution to society. And our primary lens was given that indeed, as you all reflected, there have been initiatives and there has been a lot of work going on in terms of KPIs, in terms of indicators, in terms of impact areas. But our emphasis was, and the goal was, to improve the understanding of the long-term impact pathways, so various types of research infrastructures. So what are those long chains of causality, how activities implemented by research infrastructures and carried out on research infrastructures really lead to effects further down the line, so longer term outcomes as well as trigger certain impacts. So that was the key emphasis and key mission. I'd like to go over a couple of underlying principles and expectations from this project, because I think it's important to frame that beforehand. So we were tasked to develop a framework, so a comprehensive framework, a conceptual framework, that reflects the specificities of research infrastructures. So a framework on how to scope socioeconomic impact, but for research infrastructures across their diverse missions, across their diverse types and phases of development. So what we straight away realized that this framework, whatever it will be at the end, shall be very modular, because we need to put together something coherent out of very diverse pieces, and these pieces cannot be lost, but it still needs to read as a comprehensive piece conceptually. So it needs to take into account various needs. It needs to be allow tailoring to real life cases. So that was, I think, one of the main underlying principles for the work. The second underlying principle, and I think equally important, we realized that the consortium knowledge, while very comprehensive, very fitting to the task, is obviously limited. We need to bring in all the knowledge that is out there in the communities of research infrastructures, of policymakers and funders. So the work was carried out in a highly participatory manner, engaging as many diverse research infrastructures as possible in a co-design process. So each of the research infrastructure holds a puzzle piece, certain knowledge, and only through coming together and putting it together, we can come up with something new, a synthesis of that. So over the course of the last 2 years, we have run 8 participatory workshops, which included a lot of cross-fertilization of learning and interacting between the various stakeholders. I think that has been very fruitful contribution. The third principle, while the project is about conceptual advancement, so framing, really designing a framework for how to think about the topic, we also realize that the outcomes that this project will come up with shall be very practical. It really shall result in practical toolbox for policymakers, for managers, so it shall be as practical as possible. So The first, we have two main outcomes, which also will be available in a week's time. So there's a guidebook that helps readers to get their bearings in this complex world of socioeconomic impact and how it's applied to research infrastructures. It outlines the main principles and outlines the key concepts. It sort of narrates the logic you can follow if you need to address certain impact assessment needs. But then the real data and the real wealth of information is joined up in an online toolkit. So we realized, given the wide diversity of research infrastructures, people need to access information in a very interactive manner. They want to see information that's relevant for their case. And given the wide diversity of research infrastructures, we realized that the main outcome shall be online. It shall be something people can interact with, and it shall be something we can also add on in the future. And the last maybe principle, or more of a also more formal requirement, we've been tasked to develop a European framework. So work on the way the European institutions can think about that, the European research infrastructures can apply it. But the idea was also to contribute towards a more common approach at international level. So we've engaged not only with European stakeholders, we've reached out to our collaborators in countries like Canada, Australia, US, or South Korea. And the idea is to continue maintain a dialogue also internationally. So that's I think is a principle and also an expectation from this project. When it comes to key contributions, I'll try to summarize that on a couple of slides to give you a better idea what we have produced. So I think the key thing and the main focus of the project has been on the impact pathways. So we have identified 13 generic impact pathways, how research infrastructures generally lead to various impacts on society and the economy. So how by putting resources in activity, what are the short-term and long-term outcomes, and how it trickles down into specific impacts. These pathways are generic because we realize all specific research infrastructure obviously will have details, but what it gives an overview as a structure of really reading into these pathways and reading into these causal chains. And these pathways will be detailed in the guidebook as well as on the online tool. We have grouped the 13 pathways along 3 high-level missions of research infrastructure. So the primary mission of enabling science. So if you do your regular activities that enable science, which is the main mission of research infrastructure, there's in any case certain socio-economic impact from that activity. There's also pathways that relate to problem solution when research infrastructure engages in solving problems for the private sector or the public sector. These are specific pathways. And then there are also certain pathways that come from research infrastructures shaping the fabric of science and society, which are much more blurry, much more less articulated, I think much less even scoped and measured. So I think it was very important that we did single out and try to describe them in as concrete manner as possible. To give you a glimpse into the pathways, so how do they look like? I will not go into detail, but just give you titles of the pathways we had under each of those sections. So under enabling science, you would have effects that stem from publication patterns and how it leads to recognition of a research infrastructure, effects related to employment, operations, and standardized procurement, and also very certain effects. The same goes to the pathways of technology transfer and licensing. 3 pathways related to learning and training. So one through the joint development of instruments and tools. The other related to training users, not only research users, but actually also private and public sector users. And then there are also a pathway related to training and higher education cooperation, which we also saw as a distinct one. Under problem solving, as I mentioned, their research infrastructures have a dedicated also effort to help private companies solve their problems. The same goes also for addressing societal and public sector challenges. And also especially distributed research infrastructures, we've noticed a lot of effects coming from provision of specifically curated and edited data. Details on that you will be able to read into deliverables. Last one on science and society. I think this was less articulated and I think much more difficult to scope, but we saw that research infrastructures, especially distributed ones, there's also certain effects on changing fundamentals of research practice as such, even the various locations where specific research is carried out. So that was I think a very specific one and still not yet fully described pathway. Obviously, there's a lot of effects coming from creation and shaping of scientific networks and communities, scientific networks, as well as further down the line, the user communities. I think that is a very interesting also effects that are hard to scope in very quantitative manner. Then obviously more engagement related. So by activities promoting engagement between science, society, policy, obviously generate effects. And then more one-way directions of communication and outreach activities obviously generate certain effects. So this is just a quick run through the titles of the pathways. The details is something that that users can go into detail and explore the steps. But we work not only on the pathways themselves. Our task was also to work and add on already existing knowledge base. So we worked with a long existing list of indicators that various initiatives, preceding initiatives have gathered, like the OECD and ESFRI and European Commission have come up with a list of indicators. What we've done, we've gathered that, we've sorted them according to the types of indicators, or whether they're more activity, outcome, or impact indicators, and we assign them to the specified pathways. So when people read about the pathways, they would also access information of, okay, what are the indicators currently used, quite frequent indicators, how I can attach that to the pathway I'm investigating. So that's another contribution that can be accessed through the tool. Through the workshops, we also work together with research infrastructures on ideating, brainstorming, and capturing impact areas. So what are the all possible impact areas that are relevant and frequent enough that research infrastructures can really observe? And we generated the long list of impact areas, and we categorized them across the 4 areas. So human resources, economy and innovation, society, and policy. Obviously, they are interlinked, but the idea of sticking to these titles was also a conceptual decision that somehow at some point we need to start to structure our information and structure also our thinking. So we've set to develop these ones. But we work not only on conceptual improvement, we also work together with 7 research infrastructures. So 4 our partners and 3 external research infrastructures. We try to run pilot exercises. So use our learning, use our ideas, but then try to implement the practical application to one specific impact area or one specific assessment problem. And here we also gathered learning as a additional add-on from the project. The learning from the pilot exercises you'll be able to hear on our webinar, which will be held on 29th of June. So this is more of a spotlight, learn and tips and tricks from real life cases that you can access. Last but not least, I think the interactive mode and of the project, and the fact that all the deliverables were developed in very consecutive manner, adding on, not introducing something that is outside already known areas, but really adding on and expanding our understanding. I think our one of the contributions is that we try to introduce a more shared impact assessment language. We've come across that this is a field where research infrastructures, policymakers, funders, evaluation professionals, and other interested groups are coming together, and we really need to start to get the common language, at least more common language, in order to convey the meaning. And I think that's a very important contribution. Another thing, and that's a side contribution. We didn't expect from the beginning, but I think it's a very important one and much appreciated, that through these events and the workshops and exchanges, we forge a community of practice that tries to cross-fertilize the learning and promote this common understanding. Because in many cases, the professionals that are tasked to do impact assessment within research infrastructures, in many cases they're either alone or have 25% of their time on the topic, and they're really eager to meet other professionals from different research infrastructures to exchange. And those exchanges were very practical, and I think a lot of learning was disseminated through that. So this is maybe the key things on our key contributions. But as I mentioned, there will be a guidebook, a PDF document that narrates more in detail the learning. But the aim of making sure this is practical, I also want to give you an insight into the online tool that's shaping up, and that will be accessible to everyone publicly in a week's time. And the toolkit includes all the data, all the in-depth descriptions in a more interactive manner. So I will give you a sneak peek of the design views of the tool. So you will be able to download the guidebook on the tool itself. And the tool is having a couple of sections. So there will be an information on the impact pathways, the titles of which I already showed, but more into detail the descriptions. There will be information on impact areas, the ones that we detailed, and the examples. There will be also a section on examples for reporting tools and examples how to apply certain methods to scope certain impacts at the level of examples, a lot of which also have been generated through the pilot exercises. There also will be a section which gathers all the long list of indicators, irrespective of the pathway that people can browse through, and a glossary, our contribution to more shared language and more shared understanding. Important is to know that for people who are new to the topic, and that's in a lot of cases, research infrastructures face that, we also have a section called Get Started, which allows users to answer certain questions of their relevance, and then also get guidance on which impact pathways are priorities to them. So some sort of guidance. And the toolkit can explore, as I said, in very interactive manner in order the user wants. So if I'm interested in impact pathways, I would go there and read about that. If I'm interested only in indicators, irrespective of the pathway, this is my field of interest, I will go and check the indicators. So if I'm confused, I will start with the Get Started section and get some clarity of where shall I start. So I'll show the impact pathways, the ones already highlighted you on the slides. So this is the long list of pathways, 13 pathways across 3 broad areas. Each of the pathways obviously can be expanded, and people can browse and read through them, compare them, see what is the learning there generated. Each pathway includes a button called More Information, where I can explore the pathway in more detail. So upon the, for instance, expanding a pathway on training and higher education cooperation, I would receive a description, a visual schematic representation where I can read what the icons really mean. But in this page, you'd have the selected indicators. So the indicators that are really primary and important to keep in mind across various areas of impact. And then if I'm really interested and I want to dig deep, I would go and read also about secondary indicators. Indicators can be downloaded in Excel and PDF files, so it allows people to work offline, work together with a team, maybe refining the indicators, tailoring them, striking out, adding as we wish. So also an offline function of working forward with this is envisioned. So this is how the indicators would look like. So activity, outcome, impact indicators, and I would browse through and search only for those that I'm interested in to see in detail. as I said, if I'm confused, and the long list of pathways is indeed quite long, 13, we developed 6 questions for new users who are, maybe confused. And the 6 questions are basically trying to understand what is the primary focus of your impact assessment, who is the, for whom you are doing that, whether that's for requirement, for policymakers, for funders, or for yourself. What are the various characteristics? So in the case of a new user, for instance, a synchrotron, who does a lot of, to provide solutions for the private sector. So I'm really interested to look into that. That's my focus. I also know that my research infrastructure is building capacity and offering training opportunities. So that is also high on my priority list. And I'm doing this activity because I want to improve the operations. I want to really make sure they understand what the impacts are and how I can expand them in the future. And I know that I'm really doing quite good in terms of user and external collaborator training. This is my focus, very random, very things I can tick and untick. And upon clicking on results, I would have a view on the corresponding pathways. So from this overview, I already see that, it seems that pathway 4 and pathway 2 and pathway 5 seems to be highly relevant for my case. I also, from the color coding, see that this seems to be the first group of pathways, so enabling science pathways. So probably I will go and start with this section and start with these 3 pathways as a priority. This is just an example of how to work together to orientate in the information. Another section is related to impact areas. So as I said, we've developed the long list categorized areas, and this part is an inspiration tool. So if I want to understand what generally can be, what generally are types of impacts that come out from activities of research infrastructures, I can access a certain area, and I can see both the titles as well as more defined examples. This list is not anything comprehensive or exhaustive. This is the reason we realized it's the best to continue the co-creation, and we included a feedback box for this area to, if users find that some of the impact areas are not there, or some of the terminology, like Jennifer mentioned, it's slightly different for your research infrastructure, and that would, pointing out this fact would help the overall categorization. We invite users to submit a short comment, addition, or reaction to the categorization. So this is how we keep the co-creation open also online. The same will go for examples on reporting and analysis tools. So that will also include a list of examples for inspiration, for tailoring to your case. So there won't be any cookbooks and recipes. It's about information, accessing information that's important for you, and getting inspiration how you can do it yourself. And on indicators, as I mentioned, here we list all the long list of indicators coming already from previous contributions, and here you can access them irrespective of the pathway. So you can select your interest. For instance, I'm interested in human resources and activity indicators, or policy indicators, but outcome and impact. So I would get a list of currently existing indicators, which I also can download in PDF and Excel files. So this is shortly, a glossary also will be included here. This is shortly the overview of what the tool includes and how it will look like. It is a teaser, and I think we want to make it a teaser, so you should follow the news from our project. That by after 30th of June, there shall be an announcement. This tool is online, and you can explore in more interactive manner yourself the real details of that. That's shortly, I think, about the contributions from the project. So I think we can move into more our panel discussion. And I think you've already mentioned a lot of the challenges you've come across your previous journeys in the topic of impact assessment. But I think maybe we can do another round of your reflections on these challenges, and I really would like to collect your impressions on the right path contribution. For instance, if you look at what the key additions are to the field, whether you find really useful generally, and for instance, if you would look in the online tool, which sections right away would draw your attention, where you would explore more, and which ones trigger most your interest in. That's, I think, is a quick round of feedback from the panel. We can start with Ute again.
So to start with the last question, which triggered the most interest, I guess it was the first headline, I mean, enabling science, because that's actually what we are built for, I mean, to enable and facilitate excellent science. So I guess we would start with that. And I mean, for us, it was a parallel activity, the RI Path project and also our own project. So what we try to do is basically to be in a constant exchange, also to read your deliverables once they were published, in order also to feed into our process. What we've learned in our process is we started to collect data in the first round, and then we realized it's not specific and precise enough. That's why we had to go back basically and redesign and make it much more specific, our list of indicators. And we designed already now the ones we are planning to use for the operations phase as well. And we came up in the end with a long list of 59 indicators for the construction and the operations phase. And many of them are broken down, I mean, into specific measures. So they're informed and fed with measure data. And there we even have more than 450 lines of, let's say, specific measures. Many of them are broken down into country-specific information, but it means it's a lot of data that needs to be collected. And I'm not sure if that is really addressed in the whole RI Path project. You design the pathways, but let's say the work it takes and the collaborative effort that's needed to in fact collect the data, and I mean double check and verify the data, and then also to interpret the data. That's a huge effort, and I think that should also be taken into account, because a pathway alone, I think, is only so much helpful if you cannot prove that, I mean, this is correct and validated.
Okay, thank you. Jana?
Well, thank you very much. Well, with Ute, we are in the same project, Accelerate. Florian is there as well, and this is where we also developed our societal return reports and submitted them by the end of last year. And they were based on similar pathways that you are proposing. So basically, we have already decided and reported along some of the pathways, for example, enabling science, which were key to each of our research infrastructures. Now, I would also like to mention that it's very important what Ute says, because this is what we faced as well. It's a lot of indicators, because considering that we'll have to use a kind of, well, logical framework, meaning indicators for activities, for outcomes, for impacts, and these need to be designed at the same time as the activities in order to be able to collect the data, and then to accompany this with case studies and narratives. It took us, when we were producing our societal return report, really a lot of time. Now, according to our statute, we're an ERIC, and we need to produce impact assessment reports periodically. So it's not like monitoring of progress, which is done yearly. So this, in our case, it's designed to be every 5 years, which will, to a certain extent, limit the burden. But nevertheless, we basically need to design it in a manageable way, because we need to provide good reports, yet we, they shouldn't be overwhelming. So for us, our approach when we tried to produce our pathways was, first of all, because we created it as our report of research infrastructure, enabled to optimize our contribution, our likely impacts. We designed it in a co-creative way together with our staff. We all discussed the indicators, the narratives, the case studies. So the whole team was up to date with what we want and was able to contribute on how to provide the evidence. And on the other side, we asked the funders, what do they think about us and what their objectives are and what they appreciate. And we came up with, well, additional knowledge of what is important to them, which was not in our statute among our objectives. It's clear that whatever framework we come up with needs to be flexible. And that's why it's so important that you have a feedback box. So that you can collect further feedbacks. In our case, it turned out that, for example, the funders really appreciated the added value for each of the countries. So such as increased international collaboration of their infrastructure, improved management and administration, increased visibility, but also, for example, contribution to European research area, for example, by decreasing research gap among the countries, by supporting circulation and mobility of researchers. So it's let's say, in my opinion, what you're presenting is a very good start, which should, let's say, steer us in a direction that we will all co-create. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for pointing out. Indeed, impact assessment is teamwork, no way around that. Jennifer, your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would have loved to have had what you've presented today when we first started to try and figure out what indicators we could use within the Daria-ERIC. And were I to roll back a few years, I think the place that I would start would be with those 13 generic impact pathways, and really actually looking at those makes me more aware even than I am. I mean, we've made our decisions and we've come through this process, but I think this can really ease the discussion we had to have for later ERICs about, well, is this impact? I mean, does that really mean something? Because one of the things that I think is very difficult is a lot of what we have is proxy data. And you mentioned, for example, communications. We're very active in outreach and communications, but how can we say that, you know, the butterfly wing of a flapping of a Twitter tweet that comes out at one point somehow, you know, makes a connection somewhere else? That's very hard for us to access, but we do have reasonable confidence in the proxies that we use. And again, there is a certain slippage between performance at that point and impact, where we can say, well, actually, because we are meeting these performance goals, we think that we can actually extrapolate that there will be a certain impact, even if that impact, maybe you could prove it, but to do so would be so resource intensive that we have decided not to. And you know, having the idea of a huge basket of measures is something that we realized early on we simply couldn't. We're a relatively small organization at the center. There was no way we were going to be able to do that. So we boiled ours down to 11. And so again, I think that those 13 generic impact pathways, and obviously, I mean, we'll go back and look at those now and actually look at that mapping. And this gives us a really good reference point to say, okay, yes, you may not see this as impact, but this is how we can actually find a source that is independent that helps us make that argument. So I think that's really strong. But of course, one of the things that we all worry about is, and of course, I think anyone on the panel will know that there is this attempt to find a common set of indicators for all of the ERICs and all the research infrastructure. Of course, we know that one size doesn't fit all. So that would be something that I would wonder about, how in your toolkit you've actually managed to, or made an attempt to package this in such a way to make it very clear that not every research infrastructure is going to have all of these impact areas in the same intensity, because I think that that's an important message to get across as well. Because it is, we all, I think, have a significant impact. We all do it in different ways because, again, it starts from the science, and the science is different. Its needs are different.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Florian, your reactions?
Well, thanks. I don't have much to add to what has been said because my colleagues said already a lot. I think what I see, looking at what's been done in the past 10 years, at least what I know of, the value I see is really the comprehensiveness of what you've put together. I really appreciate that you really have managed to put together in a very accessible way all of the pathways I can think of, and really direct a user to the kind of methods and indicators that can be. It's an a la carte tool, and this is something that is really convenient. I think what I see as reflecting on our experience, we are at a point today where we see a number of timely initiatives. There is yours, there is the S3 monitoring report, and we are at ELI at least in a situation where I said this is very timely because we are moving from construction to operations. We're setting up a new organization, and we are dealing with 3 facilities which have already a culture of impact, because as I said, they had to demonstrate ex ante that they would generate impact. But again, as I said as well, it was kind of artificial. Now we are in a situation where, as RI managers, we have also not only to reflect on how much impact we're going to generate, but how are we going to generate it. And therefore, what I like is that the stool that you've put together allows really to connect the reflection on what impacts are to be generated, which as a first exercise leads you to say, who am I? What do I have to do? And this is, in our case, what we did in the context of Accelerate that both Jana and Ute mentioned, is that we took our statutes and we just thought, how do you translate those statutes into impact areas? Everything starts from science. That's the core of our mission, but obviously it doesn't stop there. And there are a number of pathways, that's the term, that have to be considered and also translated. They have to be translated into policies, into strategies. And this is also what I find very helpful there, which is that you reflect on your missions and starting from there, think about what are the concrete measures that will deliver potentially tangible impact. Now moving on to what are the challenges, I think my colleagues mentioned all of those that I had in mind. I mean, it's data collection, it's embedding that practice within the organization and getting support, because you need a number of stakeholders to understand the process and contribute to it. We have at ELI, as in many other research infrastructures, a challenge, which is that we call ourselves multi-site. We're a strongly integrated organization. We are distributed in the sense that we have two facilities that will start with Eric and a third one that will join soon after, hopefully, so that we are in a situation where there's also a need to harmonize practices. And then there's a third challenge that I see now that we're moving on to operations, is how to address that in the long term, because we have good data collection at ELI for a number of key indicators. We will have to expand that a lot as we consider new pathways that were not too much in our focus during construction. And there's a huge challenge simply in looking at that and setting up a system that is not disrupted because you go to another phase. So you have to anticipate that a bit, and you described very well, I think, in your deliverables how the impacts unfold over different periods of time, sometimes short, sometimes much longer. And that's something that is actually difficult. The last word I would say is that looking at your tool, as an RI manager, I find it fairly accessible. I don't know what a funder would say. My own experience is that the funder really focuses again on more demonstrating that there will be impact, or that there has been impact. I'm confident that this tool, this sort of approach, can help very much when it's about reporting. You show that you have a strong system in place with the methodologies behind to collect. I'm more concerned when it comes to ex ante analysis and how this is used. That's what I would say here, but it needs more thinking. That's an intuitive thought looking at what you've put together.
Thanks a lot, all for panel members. I think it's you touched very important points and very valid points. So when it comes to this information, we've really tried, our main goal was to start with a first online map. So the reference point, the map, and the information that is included here doesn't mean that it all needs to be picked up. So not all the indicators obviously can be reported, but it's a map to say what's out there, what's used, and key efforts, and that is valid for all research infrastructures. It will be a team effort to go through that information, to tailor that to the case, to answer the question that your policymakers are actually asking, and improve that. Because as you say, they can't be, you know, one overarching framework for everyone. It's impossible, but there can be one overarching map. And the idea behind this tool is that realizing we put it out there, it will be online, it will include a feedback function. Our initial idea has always been since the proposal stage that this will be open source platform, and it definitely will need another update. So 2-3 years when we've gathered enough of practical application, enough of practical evidence that this pathway is working, or this area is missing, or this indicator doesn't really connect, these indicators work perfectly, this reporting tool is what really helped me. So this sort of, we need to gather like rounds of practical applications, practical experiences, and then we can talk about regenerating this map again, updating again. And when it comes to your question about policymakers, we phrased this and we've put this out. It is currently also a first map for putting together more I think more better understanding of what are the key benefits that in general come out of research infrastructures. This tool should not serve in any case for drafting very specific requirements, because here we talk about very conceptual first map. And I think from that case, this is indeed a tool for research infrastructures much more, because we need to align the reporting practices, we need to gather that experience, and we need to feed back it again in order to, to arrive at more solid already understanding. So it's a process. It's always been a process, but I think it's important to do the first step and to put out things and then see how things connect with evidence that other initiatives have found and how it really flows. So yes, we're open up to revisions in the years to come. But at least as a reference point, we hope that especially for research infrastructures have zero experience in this, as Jennifer pointed out, can help as a tool where I start to think about together with my team about impact, and I have some guidance on how to do that. But I also have more tailored questions, because we always had in mind that research infrastructures are very diverse, so also very diverse types and phases of development needs to have specific requirements in mind. But I think we need to gather that insight in order to articulate that. Well, we have articulated sort of high-level modularity. There is a certain types of research infrastructures that do have, certain impacts more than others. And so there is definitely a distinction between physical and virtual, and single-sited and distributed, as well as social science and humanities do have different emphasis in their impact package than, for instance, what natural science research infrastructures have. But that is a very high level and a shallow maybe reading into it. What I would like to talk next with you, maybe you can, coin what sort of specificities we would need to design in there, maybe in the future. And I would start with Ute, because ESS as a in a construction phase, and you've been dealing with impact since really the inception. So what type of guidance do you considering especially relevant for research infrastructures in a construction phase? So what your viewpoint are the information and steps that you think, for instance, next research infrastructures in the construction phase would really need? How can you coin them for future uptake?
So I would have, let's say, two key recommendations. The one recommendation is start as soon as possible. Make it part of your mandate as well, because I mean, for us, socio-economic impact assessment is not part of our regular budget. So far, it has been mainly financed basically through EU grants. And if your funders expect you to report regularly, then it should also be, I mean, a headline in your budget planning, and that resources should be allocated. We started fairly early in the construction process, and we were able, I mean, to get the top town buy-in of our top management, and at the same time also bottom up. I mean, we developed the whole framework together with the colleagues in the respective divisions, who in the end will have to deliver the data for that. And I mean, the easier you make it, especially for the in-house colleagues, the better it is. So make it part of your management systems. Whatever kind of project management tools you're going to use, I mean, try really, I mean, to use them to your advantage for the impact assessment, so the data is already there, especially when it comes to procurement, in-kind or whatever. Make it easy for the colleagues. Yes, resource it and make it easy, and build also a tool that you, I mean, a database that helps you basically to track and carry it forward to the future. When it comes to the biggest challenge we are currently facing is the assessment of the in-kind contributions. And there we have now pursued two different, let's say, pilot studies. One was in the framework of the Accelerate project that Sarek and Janas is leading, where we worked together with one in-kind partner who did a self-assessment and seeing what kind of impact did the collaboration and the contribution of in-kind to ESS have for their institute and for their national and regional economy. That was one approach. And the other one was with another in-kind, no, actually not with the in-kind partner, but simply using data mining as a tool to assess, basically, in this case, the supply chain of our in-kind contractors and see who were the suppliers, what did they contribute, and what kind of impact did it have to the, I mean, competitiveness, for example, of the companies that were in the construction or involved in the construction of this in-kind contribution. And that is the second recommendation and learning. Should a facility be built also using the model of in-kind contributions, make the impact assessment part of your in-kind agreements, because we at ESS, we don't know the supply chain of our in-kind contributors. I mean, we know it, let's say, on a top level, of course, because it's relevant for all the quality aspects and the warranty. However, I mean, when it comes to the real impact assessment, the more you can put into the agreement, the easier it is later on. And since in-kind is a part of a return model, I mean, it's better for everyone to be aware of the potential impact generated in the construction.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Ute. Now, a question to Jana. Given the, you've seen what we as a field have generated in the last years in various projects, how these advances in our understanding are meeting the needs of distributed research infrastructure. So what should be taken into account? What is still, what is already there, and what still needs to be improved in the future to really help distributed research infrastructures to report and actually think about their impact internally?
Thank you. Now, I can't stress enough how happy I am that you came up with this modular approach in the form of pathways, and that it's also expected to grow in the future, so that you consider it only as a first step, because this is the only way, in my opinion, that we can really report on our impacts. This is what I tried to say already in the introductory remarks. But I really think that you've done a great job in this case. Now, what Ute said is extremely important to consider also as a distributed research infrastructure. From the start, what are the potential impacts, and design the pathways with indicators from the start. And this will enable us to demonstrate at any point what our contributions are whenever, for example, our funders ask us, And for example, the recent report that we produced within Accelerate along the pathways proved already to be useful when there was the assessment by the high-level group that was led by Giorgio Rossi that sent us questions half a year ago, and we were able to produce replies based on our pathways and the impacts that we think that we can credibly describe within a few days. So I think that the approach that you're designing is incredibly useful for the infrastructures. Now, when it comes to the policymakers, I share the opinion of Florian that this needs to be seen how they can use the approach for their own needs. But the important part is that you plan to upgrade this. Now, I would really like to mention two things when it comes to this. First of all, the approach, because the indicators, the tool is not yet ready to be considered by us in detail, so we cannot see the indicators. But I would expect to see the indicators, for example, from the ESFRI monitoring working group in this, so that we don't add up with two systems where they overlap. Monitoring is completely different from impact assessment, but there are some indicators that can be used from the ESFRI work. Now, it's important to notice, to report also on what we noticed in that working group, monitoring working group. And what we kept emphasizing is that it's perfectly clear that indicators cannot, that there's no system of indicators that could be applicable and enforced along all the research infrastructures. And it's the same with your approach, that it's a modular one. Research infrastructures can decide which ones to take, but there's a lot more clarity that your tool brings into the game. Now, the second part is that it will continue to be upgrading. And in this case, I would, because especially for the distributed research infrastructures, what you asked me, it's important, for example, to consider what each of the funders want, not just the funders collectively. So what is the impact on each of the members that are funding it? Which is something that I've not yet seen clearly here. But of course, we don't have the access to the full toolkit at the moment. So it's in this case, it's important for me that to know that someone will continue working on this toolkit, because otherwise all this wonderful work will just basically not reach the whole potential. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So just a quick remark. Indeed, the list of indicators do take, we work on the lists already developed by ESFRI, OECD, as well as Commission. So those should be in, the key things should be in, it should not overlap. It's just that the consolidation and deleting overlaps and stratifying that. Indeed, I also share your view that policymakers would be more difficult to see the more detailed requirements that policymakers would like to see. But as I say, in our view, and the consortium has come to the conclusion that it's still further down the line. We are still not there yet. It's still a longer process to not only to draw that map, but to conceptualize and actually to uptake it in the community and feedback a bit what's working, what's not. So that's the process we are in. But anyways, a dedicated question to Jennifer, because up to now, the impact assessment field has been more dominated by examples as well as applications and experiences by research infrastructures in the field of natural sciences. And you, as a representative of social science and the humanities, do you find that the current impact assessment discourse is really addressing the needs and specificities of these type of research infrastructures? Because in many cases, it's not about the idea itself, the pathway itself, but rather how it's expressed, where the emphasis is put. So that's maybe you can reflect on that question.
Yeah, I think my answer my answer to that's going to have deeper roots than you may have necessarily wanted or expected. But I think we have a problem, particularly in the arts and humanities. And again, this is part of my own research, so apologies for the mini rant. But because we have less of a strong epistemic kind of vocabulary around the arts and humanities, and this has been related by various people back to various trends in the history of science, technology studies, but also in, I mean, just the nature of the disciplines and the nature of the objects of studies. You know, we learn language naturally from the age of 2. Well, why does that necessarily mean that we need to study the impact of that? Does that mean that we can see a higher or lower impact of disciplines that study language, literature, and related fields like that? So I think in general, when I see the fact that there is a more advanced vocabulary and discussion around impact in the sciences, that looks to me as really more of not a reflection on the discussion of impact, but more a reflection of the discussion of, well, where do the arts and humanities fit as science, you know, as we have come to refer to them as science in English as well. Although many of my colleagues would still very much resist that. So I think when I see, again, I mentioned the idea that, you know, economic impact is a very strong indicator for a lot of ERICs, but not for us. This is the kind of thing where I say, okay, well, it's our responsibility to not just say, okay, wait, this isn't the way things work for us to actually chase that indicator. And this is, of course, all the fear that we have, is that if the impact comes before you design what you want and what you need. And I mean, I take Uta's point very, very strongly, would reiterate it very strongly, that the earlier a research infrastructure can think about impact, the better. But that doesn't mean that you design for impact. You design for, you know, you design for the goals of the infrastructure, but then you have to look at impact as a kind of a reflection of that. So rather than saying, right, well, because economic impact is important for research infrastructures, we suddenly need to find a way to do that. What we need to do instead is find, again, that vocabulary, those examples, those reflections of that same set of goals and values that fit with the disciplines that we work with. So that's really the challenge, but it is really a two-way street. So for us, I think it is important to come up with those responses and those reflections, but I think it's also important for those actors, be they funders, be they the European Commission, be they ESFRI, who are looking to see these impact indicators put in place and to see really good, strong impact stories for the ERICs developed and communicated. I think it's up to them as well to trust us, that we actually know our research, we know our users, and we know where that impact can lead, so that we are in many ways in the best position to say, okay, this is the kind of impact that is relevant. Not saying we're avoiding it, but saying this is the way you can really see us flourish.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Also, a small remark from my side. We have tried to have this tool, and yeah, it was developed in a very co-creative manner. But co-creation only works if there is a balance of the general distribution of research infrastructures. So that's actually my call to all of the research infrastructures. If you don't feel that there is the language of your type of research infrastructure, or the phrasing or logic is not yet represented, this needs to be back. We need to receive that feedback. And I think up to now it has been a successful project, but a successful co-creation, but we need to keep that balance. Okay, then Florian, a dedicated question to you, because the topic of socioeconomic benefits and the impacts of major research infrastructures is also something that's very relevant in research infrastructures in Central and Eastern Europe, also from cohesion perspective. And given the experience at the ELI, and given the experience you had also of ELI being funded from structural funds, do you think the current framework, the current logic and thinking and discourse is sufficient to help these research infrastructures to navigate through this complex topic and actually find their answers and find their demonstration of impact in a very more meaningful way?
Yes and no, I would say. Yes, I think there's really something of value in what EFIS has put together, which is, as I said earlier, the comprehensiveness. Clearly, I mean, in the context of regional policy, investing in research infrastructures requires, as I said, a cost-benefit analysis. That's the tool, it's regulated, and that's the tool you use for demonstration of impact. I think the tool, as I said as well, has improved itself a lot compared to 10 years ago. It's much more refined. I think it's more tailored now to research infrastructures. What I appreciate in the framework that you've put together is showing the complexity of impact in terms of different pathways again, and the fact that there's simply no one methodology that one can rely on, but that a lot more different perspectives and approaches are needed. That's one aspect. Another one is, I think that is very important to me, and I don't know exactly, I don't know whether that's reflected now in what you've put together as much as I'd like it to be. It's the importance of context. So pathways are important. Pathways highlight more or less complex causal relationships. And this is already very good to have that in mind, that it's not a direct relationship, but that understanding that causal chain is essential. Now there needs to be a realist approach to that takes really into account the regional context of the research infrastructure. There are no universal truths, and you've already reflected on that. I've seen that in a number of deliverables, but that's an essential aspect that when looking at impact is very important, both on the side of the research infrastructure and of the policymakers or financial funding agencies. Sorry. And why is it important is that I think what cohesion is aiming at is not only having regions catching up at a macroeconomic level, obviously, but it's looking at that investment, that research infrastructure, and looking at how it's going to be, how that investment is wise in terms of how it's embedded in a particular context, and that seed has all the nutriments to actually fertilize and grow. But it's also about appropriation of results. You don't want to have the seed there and that all of the impact goes somewhere else. Of course, it will go somewhere else as well, but there needs to be an embeddedness in the region that is not neglected. And so when you run a CBA, that's something you may want to look at by, I mean, there's a risk analysis that is involved, and obviously you test your assumptions with that risk analysis, but it goes beyond that, I think. So I think for a research infrastructure that would look at, or even a funding agency that would look at the framework you've put together in a cohesion context, I would really insist on that aspect. Then comes another thought, and the last one on that is, again, CBA is the requirement. You need to demonstrate a positive socio-economic return. I think there needs to be more focus also from funding agencies and research infrastructures on using structural funds specifically on how they are equipped to monitor socio-economic impact, and whether there's a strategy behind. That's what I said earlier. And the tool here that we have, I think, is a very good starting point to design a strategy. So that's what I would say. So it's very valuable to have that for sure. Now it doesn't change the requirements at the moment for using structural funds, which is a CBA. So again, context and understanding the causality in that context is one key requirement I would insist on.
Thank you very much for these insightful comments. I think indeed you brought to the forefront another other complexity level, the context. And I think indeed this tool can't navigate all the complexities and can't take into account all the complexities, especially when it reaches out of the sphere of influence for research infrastructures. But one thing I wanted to remind, it can serve as a backbone, these causal pathways can serve as a backbone for a really strategy process, as you mentioned. And also research infrastructures, given that the further down the line impact generate, you see the impact, across the years, it might be becoming very blurry and actually very hard to trace any type of data and put any type of conclusion on that. But we find that indeed impacts are beyond the sphere of influence for research infrastructures. It's really interesting, but it's beyond the sphere. But maybe we should invest more and more effort in really monitoring, trying to find better indicators and better actually describe the outcomes and the real outcomes, long-term outcomes. These should be also coming together with the strategy process. So we hope this will help research infrastructures to think about that. But without further delay, I thank for your comments, but we shall turn to the audience questions. I think Henning is already ready to start with some questions from the audience. Give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena. Already in the starting position for some time, but now finally. Brief words of opening. I see 78 people currently participating, so that makes it a bit difficult to look at your green hands for those that know the webinar system here. So what I would ask everyone to do is to put their question in the question system, because that does give me an order of asking people to the floor. And what I would then still like to do is to give you the opportunity to ask your question in person by unmuting you and giving you the opportunity to speak to us and to show your face also, if you want to, because I think that's easier than me reading out texts, which are partially, luckily, already quite long here in what I see. So I would like to start with Claudia Alena Amaro, who was first at 10:15 to ask the first question, or to declare the intention to ask the first question. So I'm unmuting you now, so you should be able to ask your question to the panel or to the team, however you see fit. The floor is yours.
Hi, I thank you very much for this webinar. It's really useful. I am Claudia Lem from Instruct, and I have a couple of issues. It will be really interesting to have your views. One you have already touched on, and is the interaction between this toolkit and the KPIs we are all working on from ESFRI, the list that we need to work on. We have to not only decide which of the KPIs in that list we are going to be measuring, but also on the process. If we decide a KPI is not appropriate for us, I'm sure we need to have some sort of documentation of process of why we think this one is not appropriate for us. And I was wondering if a part of this toolkit that, of course, I haven't seen, you have that sort of a discussion on it when you decide that a KPI is not really appropriate for you, how you document that issue. That is one point. And then my second point, very, very different, is something you also have touched a bit upon, is we at the research infrastructure are really aware of how different we are and how you cannot measure different things with the same measuring tools. However, we receive from member countries questionnaires to fill in, which are clearly show that some member countries are not in any way aware that you cannot measure different things in the same way. Then I was wondering if ARAPath as a project has done any activities to try in a way to educate funding bodies on how you cannot measure a wet lab in the same way you measure a synchrotron and that sort of thing. Then those are the two main issues I wanted to bring up, and thank you again for all the discussions, which has been really useful.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Elena, this goes back to us first. So maybe you first briefly on the second one and maybe aspects of the first one. And for the first question, I think I would then also like to go back to the panel, because there may be experiences from the research infrastructures themselves of how they do that we could currently only reflect. But Elena, you first.
Yeah, for the second question, we've run rounds of interviews with policymakers in a national level as well as EU level, and we obviously were aware at the start of the project that requirements from the national level, there is no common understanding. But up to now, we have not engaged in a communication activity on this topic, because we are now at the line. Well, basically, we are now in the process of finalizing the framework, so it will be communicated to the stakeholder community, and the idea is that this message is very strongly featured in our outputs. So it should be very relevant that, look, at the European level, we acknowledge there can't be one single measure for all research infrastructures. And I think that sort of understanding shall need to have another trickle down and further processes. Also, communication from the Commission to the national member states should be done with the findings from RIPATH in mind. So that would be my question, my answer to that.
Okay, I see Jana.
Yes, so since there was also a question regarding the ESRI KPIs, and I was in a group developing contributing to this development, I would like to address the first part. Now, ESRI working group had a mandate to come up with a set of KPIs that could be applicable to the RIs. Now, we have mentioned in the report, which was adopted by ESRI, in December, that it's extremely important that we cannot, that infrastructures are different. We need to acknowledge this variety, and that all the KPIs cannot be used across all the RIs, also because, for example, they need to measure the progress towards objectives, and the research infrastructures do not have many objectives in common. In fact, the only one they have in common, all of them, is enabling of science. So while there is important to have some agreed KPIs, let's say a list from which research infrastructures can choose the relevant ones for them, this is important because, for example, we measure contribution to excellent science with a number of indicators like publications and so on. And it's important that we are aligned when it comes to this, so that we speak about the same things when it's possible to speak about the same things, not that everyone expresses the same measure with a different indicator, if it's possible to align. So there's a number of slightly different indicators that research infrastructures were using that can benefit from a structured approach. But it's extremely important, and the group, ESRI group, mentioned it over and over again, that the context is important, the modular approach is important. And the proposal was that in order to adopt the indicators, there would be a discussion between strategic working group members, research infrastructures, including their boards, and their funders. And this kind of discussion that would lead into what are the appropriate indicators for each of the infrastructures would also contribute to the first question, which is how do we convince the funders that we are different? And this would be the way. I think we basically need more discussion about this. And there's one thing that cannot be stressed enough, is that we absolutely wouldn't want to come up with a system where we have the data along various KPIs and the funders start comparing the infrastructures without the context. I think this would be a very dangerous approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Yes, Claudia, I absolutely feel the stress that you're under. In fact, I remember there was a workshop on the the report that Jana was just speaking of last July. And I remember at the same time that the speaker from the podium was saying, these are not meant to compare research infrastructures with each other. I had a representative of a national funding agency, I won't say which one, sitting next to me saying, well, of course we're going to do that. That's what we need to do. I only have so many euros. I'm going to spend them in one place and not the other. So we know that unfortunately the good work, and I really think it was excellent work by the high-level expert group to actually really contextualize and really say, well, okay, this is the high level. And I think at that same meeting, the idea of a Chinese menu where you know everyone will have rice, but not everyone will have meat or fish, was mentioned. So the way we've approached this in Daria has been very much to say, right, we're not going to be defensive about things we are not. If we are not, you know, citation analysis does not work in the arts and humanities the way it does in other disciplines. It simply doesn't. So we're not going to get defensive about that. We're just going to say, this doesn't work. But at the same time, we always provide an alternative. Say, if you want to understand the goal of citation analysis, which is to understand, is the science being used, is there being an impact, then for our disciplines, you need to look at this kind of indicator. So I think the real key is to always respond to those kinds of requests by saying, this doesn't work. If you can give a short and cogent reason why, by all means, give that, but say, we recommend as an alternative to meet this goal for us, you look at this. And I think that that's really the only way that we as research infrastructures can actually meet this desire to kind of, you know, rank us and, you know, just kind of cut us off at number 10 or whatever it is that this desire is to sort of guide funding, to actually talk about the real impacts in our own terms, in the way we make a difference, rather than trying to always say, well, we're not that, we're not that, we're not that, we're not that, because then the message of the impact we have gets lost.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we may want to move to the next question. Now I have an echo, but the next question would be from Daniel Orenstein, so I will try to unmute you to ask it in your own words. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Actually, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Actually, the last round of answers were very much oriented to the same kind of question that I'm asking, so I appreciate the previous question. As he said, my name is Daniel. I'm responsible for the socio-economic impact assessment in the European long-term ecological research infrastructure, which just joined the ESFRI roadmap earlier this year. So this has been an incredible introduction to the topic for me. I'm also sitting on reports from the OECD and ESFRI's own indicators that they include in their socioeconomic impact assessment. So I'm going to have to be juggling these various sources. And I appreciate also your emphasis on having to forge our own path and develop an assessment based on our own expectations of ourselves. My question is really, now is the next stage. We're going to produce indicators where we perform, we have empirical indicators, we have narratives. How do we know, is there any measure, are we measuring ourselves against something to say, yes, we've succeeded, or this is an indicator of success? Because if I say 4 for the answer to anything, it has to be 4 relative to something. So how do you take these reports and then go to the next step and say, this is an indicator of what we do and that we're succeeding? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any reactions from the panel directly or from you, Elena? Jennifer?
Sorry, I don't want to dominate, but I think there's a really, from my point of view, there's a really straightforward answer. You improve your impact and you grow according to a baseline of your own ERIC over time. And I think that that's actually the most important thing to do. We're only just establishing these baselines now. You know, there may be areas where there is something that you can, something firm that you can aim towards, but I think we really need to get the message across that rather than trying to compare across ERICs or compare to some kind of platonic ideal of impact, we need to actually show that we are growing and changing over time, and I think that's the strongest.
Okay, thank you. Florian first, then Jana.
No, I don't have much to add to that. I think, you know, I mentioned earlier that it's important to look at impact over time. That's what I meant as well. You need to have an idea how you're going to improve in various areas, how much time each type of impact will take to materialize. But I very much agree with Jennifer. In some cases, you may compare against other facilities, or there might be some reference, but in most cases, you don't have that. You will rely on your own history and path.
Okay, thank you. Jana?
Thank you.
Yeah, very similar answer. I think 42 only works in Hitchhiker's Guide as the right answer. In the real world, especially when it comes to impact assessment, the situation's very complex, and we need to embrace this complexity and produce the best evidence we can for our own case.
Okay, Elena, we wouldn't disagree, would we?
No.
From the project. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We will then move to the next question, which is by Herbert Haubold. I have to find you in my 80 people further down the line, but now you should have the floor. Yeah.
Yes, I just heard that I can speak.
Yes, you can.
I've put my question into the box, and I think much of this has already been answered before. Because it's also going in line with what Daniel, I'm actually the same RI in ELTA as Daniel is. We're collaborating, and we have independently of each other have similar things. For us, we always have the problems that a lot of impacts can be relatively straightforwardly measured, and of course we're tempted to measure these, like how many PhDs are there, how much employment do we have, how much physical infrastructure. But for us, all these things are pretty small in comparison to many other infrastructures. And so the true impact is of course not this, because as an environmental RI, we don't want to, let's say, create business for sensor developments or so on. That is something which is a byproduct. But the true impact happens, as someone said before, outside of our sphere of control. So the true impact happens only if stakeholders take up the results which we produce. That's what the real impact is. So we can actually produce these impacts and enable then others in a collaborative effort to create the true impact. And the true impact is something like better ecosystem services, cleaner air, cleaner water, just to put it simply. But these are things which have, for example, huge environmental and therefore also societal impacts on health, for example, which is of course extremely important, extremely valuable, but almost impossible to quantify. And I never believed in these monetarization efforts, how to monetize ecosystems or to monetize health. I think this goes beyond what it really is. And so therefore, I would be very happy to get more advice how in this modular and this tool system, we can approach these long-term things. So these long-term things which cannot be measured, but which of course are the true value of the RI.
Okay, Elena, possibly?
Yes, I think you touched a very important point, because one of the key things we also wanted to gain more insight is we know how to trace certain quantifiable indicators, we know about certain quantifiable methods, but what we lack any kind of tools is these things you can't measure. It's too much down the line, and I already mentioned indeed that we should not shy away, and I think we should bring to the forefront the power of a good narrative, because there's a distinction between a story that is just put together as selling your research infrastructure's impact, and a good narrative that is grounded on a pathway thinking, which is trying to pull together as much as possible data from outcomes that you can measure still, which is in the scope of research infrastructure's influence, and then narrate the logic of how you see that impact evolving, but really in a very logical and very grounded way. And I think this is something that, when it comes to reporting to policymakers, this is something that policymakers will read. This is also something that the external stakeholders will read and pick up, because yes, we can dedicate lots of months and prepare dedicated impact assessment reports. The key stakeholders will read very grounded narratives in the end, which come from these reports. So I think we should invest and bring shine the light back to the strength of a good narrative, as well as explore where it is possible more. We give some indications, also more blue sky approaches. So indeed, I think one of you mentioned data mining. So there is some things we can gather data which doesn't involve, manual reporting and collecting that into the database, but something where we can use external data mining tools, like tracking your social media impact with the tools already out there. I think there is a scope to really employ more and more these tools. But for that, we need piloting, with that we need application, and we need to feed back that learning of how it worked and whether it's worthwhile to try in other cases.
Okay, thank you. Ute?
Yeah, indeed, this is also what I would like to add is, I mean, we don't really have the tools for some of those things at the moment. And I'm struggling at the moment is how to get ready for operations and how will we as a research infrastructure that will facilitate and enable science measure and track our contribution we make, for example, to mission-based research. How do we do that? And data mining would be, for example, one of those approaches that gives us, I mean, a starting point with the experiment, and then going through time and over time, hopefully be able to see what kind of long-term effects that has, not only on the science, but then also on the economical take-up, for example.
Okay. Beyond that, I've seen movements of support with Florian and Jana, but I don't think these were direct announcement of interventions. So let me move ahead to the next question, which is by Syed Ashraful Alam on the kind of opposite question on what there already is in terms of CBA. And maybe from my side to answer quickly, in this project, we of course looked at it. We found that there was already a lot ongoing and a lot available. Florian made the point earlier on. I mean, this started kind of roughly about a decade ago and then was refined and refined step by step. So it was more on this project that we at some point realized, okay, there's so much already. It's difficult to add along these lines. So we'll go into all the other directions in terms of comprehensiveness that we can cover that have been less covered so far. But I would like to take the opportunity to give the word to our colleague Sylvia, who on the side of CSIL has been working quite a bit along these lines. So the question is not really, is there anything? Yes, there is, but maybe she can say a few words on what there already is available, because we all know there's quite a bit already around. Sylvia, would you like to say a bit?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So good morning. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on this interesting topic. And thank you, Henning, for giving me the chance to say something about cost-benefit analysis. Indeed, as it was mentioned by Florian before, a long time has passed since the beginning of the story, when the first time, I think it was precisely for the ELI project, that you were pioneering the use of cost-benefit analysis. That was indeed, it has a very long story from theoretical, but also a more practical point of view, but for more traditional kind of infrastructure. So it's true that some adaptations were needed in order to be, for the methodology to be more tailored to the specificities of research infrastructure. And indeed, a lot of progress has been made in this respect. A large number of research infrastructure have been assessed with the cost-benefit, on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis for the request for co-funding for the structural funds. And I believe that the method as it stands now, which is still evolving in this moment, has also benefited from the reflections in terms of looking at the mechanism and at the impact pathways. So I say that the reflection on the question about how impacts materialize, which are the different channels, looking at the different types of users that interact with the research infrastructure and get benefit out of this interaction, these kind of reflections has also informed the way in which, so to say, more traditional methodologies have been applied to socioeconomic impact assessment of research infrastructures. And I think that the way in which now cost-benefit analysis is applied to, there are quite a number of examples that are now available for large physical infrastructures, but also for distributed infrastructure. I think that a long journey has been made also for this methodology, and I think that it also recognizes the fact that there are different kind of benefits and types of impacts that can be accounted for in a structured and consistent way. So I think that the way in which more traditional methodologies have been involved have been permeated in some way by the discussions that have been made in this field. So yes, I think that we shall remain a little bit open in trying to use different types of methodologies depending on the kind of impact that we want to report on.
Okay, thank you very much, Sylvia. I think for these very lucid words of conclusion there towards the end, saying there's an interpermeation of the different approaches that we are currently seeing. I think that is indeed very useful. So hasn't that answered the question?
Yes, this is Saeed. So I'm also working for ELIXIR RI, and currently we are in the phase of going for this kind of cost benefit analysis. Thank you very much, and I think my question was partly answered, and I have really reviewed some of the articles or some of the methods that is already available online. So for example, some of the benefits, those we call like tangible benefits, for example, how many papers you're publishing, how many PhDs you're providing, that actually you can monetize in terms of, if you think about the benefits, if you put in the terms monetary values, that is really possible. But there are some other non-tangible benefits. For example, let's say biodiversity conservation, then cleaner air and water. So I was thinking about how to monetize. I know that we can write something like qualitative text, but has anything been done or some kind of, I was also looking for, let's say, the ESPRI guidelines, but I didn't really find anything about that. So I'm just wondering, is there anything that the other RIs, other established ERICs, they have done something so that we can follow and then we can compare and we can really fit for our purpose to make a really very good cost benefit analysis for ELIXIR RI. Thank you. If you can elaborate this issue a little bit more.
Okay,
nice.
Quickly back to the panel to Florian.
Yes, thanks, Henning. Well, Sylvia would respond to that better than I would. I think there are answers to that in the project that I mentioned, or the outputs of the project I mentioned, which is called ABUS, to which I think Sylvia collaborated or contributed, sorry, where in many cases you just look at willingness to pay as an approach to monetize those things. Now, even though I would agree with Sylvia that the methodologies have improved, they are more specific now to research infrastructures. This exercise of monetization remains in many cases a bit artificial for an RI. If it's requested, you go through it. I could enter more into the detail, and I'm available, Syed, if you want to discuss that more in detail. And there are people who are more expert than I am, I think, who would be available to do that. But in general, in our case at Eli, we used typically that was for actually monetizing access itself, the value of the access we would be providing. We used an approach which was willingness to pay. And I would assume that in a number of other cases for some outputs of the facility, you could use the same approach.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's muted himself. It's clever and in charge of the thing. Doesn't mute himself.
Back to you, Elena, or?
I didn't hear.
I think we don't hear you.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Next in line would have been Susie Robinson, who in the meantime stated the question was answered. So the question was just back to Susie Robinson. Is that indeed the case, or is there anything further that you would like to table now?
No, my question and pondering was around that ability to cast forward outside your own spheres of control, and whether through the pilots and the use of the framework you'd identified any really positive ways in which that could be done. But I took the commentary around the importance of those analytical narratives as being perhaps the best shot that we have at that at this point, which is just really useful to have reinforced. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Jana, briefly, yeah.
Well, since I'm back, I really think that in this case, I very much agree with the importance of this narratives, and this is what the current approach, the toolkit that's proposed, offers. And in my possible with some kind of narratives and case studies to provide convincing evidence for the policymakers that we are about to deliver on this particular long-term impact. Now, nevertheless, we will have in the future probably, we'll have to look at some further indicators to strengthen this part, especially when it comes to societal development goals. Because ESFRI white paper now says that research infrastructure should contribute, also refer to societal development goals in their missions. And when we try to then demonstrate our contribution to this societal development goals, yes, we'll need the narratives, but we will need also some kind of KPIs to measure this. In this case, infrastructures, this is not only the problem of research infrastructure, but the whole field of research. So I think that European Commission will have to help us, or will help us in this way anyhow.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Next question would be by Pedro Rosso.
Hi, I hope that you can hear me, but I think you are great. So my question was, and first of all, thank you so much for the seminar and for all the panel. It was very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to see the toolkit. I work at Leiden University, and my question is more related with some of the performance indicators for staff. Of course, inclusion and diversity being connected with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also with some of the societal goals that we have within Europe. I was wondering if the diversity of the staff working for research infrastructures is one of the performance indicators that you have in the toolkit and the impact assessment toolkit.
I think, Henning, that goes back to you.
Would you say something first? Sorry, I was distracted.
Yeah. Inclusion is one of the impact areas that was identified under society, impact on society. Under indicators, I think this part wasn't included because it is about consolidation of most important ones. So it doesn't mean that all the emerging areas of impact will be included there. So if this is important for your research infrastructure, and this is an important impact on society, then your research infrastructure shall devise a specific indicator to tailor to this. This is my reading from the list of indicators. Maybe Jana has addition to that, but that's how it currently stands. It doesn't feature in this long list of indicators.
I think the discussion we did have was that we do have it in the list of indicators here and there, but we already would, of course, be very convinced that it is a name in itself in the activities. It is already a name on how you should perform activities, so it goes there. So it will be cross-cutting, of course, in the activities themselves, and then eventually in the impacts that it does cause, but that would depend on the individual setup to a stronger extent. then with other indicators where the activity as such will be science, and then you look for impacts. And this obviously with inclusion is quite different. So it's probably covered here in a different manner, but you do find it here and there in the indicator set.
Okay, I think we've run through our 2-hour session, and we might have more questions in there, but we won't take any more. You can also only type in the comment box, and it will save questions to our side. But I wanted to give some concluding words. I think what our discussion today have proved that we've come a great length in improving our understanding on this topic. There have been really dedicated working groups at ESFRI, Commission, OECD, and many others, as well as dedicated projects, RIPATH, Accelerate, and many others, to pilot and more tailor our understanding. And I think I would like to thank the panel for the insights that you brought together from your perspectives, from your diverse experiences, as well as thank for the questions raised, and Henning for moderating that. From RIPAT's side, just a remark that those who have subscribed to the webinars, and obviously those who are in our community of people who participate in our seminars, those who emails we have hold under the database, you will receive a notification when the tool is out and when the guidebook can be downloaded. So that will be right after 30th of June when the project ends. We do really hope you will dive into that, take it as an interactive exercise, explore it, tailor it, but also feed back your experience with it. So what is something missing from our current understanding? Can something be tailored better in the future? And this will definitely help our common effort to shape a more common understanding and shape a more common language, and essentially then also solve all the issues of requirements and how to address them in a meaningful way, in a possible way, and something that brings benefit to both policymakers and research infrastructures. So that's in short is all. I thank you for your participation, and have a lovely day.